The summer of 1882 brought drought to Powder Creek County, but it also brought the annual Founders Dance, and that was something even the parched earth couldn't diminish. Sarah McKenzie had been looking forward to it for months, ever since her mother had finished the calico dress, blue as a robin's egg, with white lace at the collar. At 19, Sarah was the pride of the Circle M Ranch. She could rope a calf faster than most men, read Latin from her mother's old books, and had a laugh that carried across the prairie like church bells. Her father, Thomas McKenzie, had built his spread from nothing, and he'd built his daughter to be strong, capable, and unafraid. The town hall was strung with paper lanterns when the McKenzies arrived in their wagon. Fiddle music spilled out into the dusty street, and the smell of punch and cornbread made Sarah's stomach rumble. Her father helped her down, his weathered hands gentle despite their calluses. "You be careful tonight," he said, adjusting his bolo tie. "And you come find me if anyone gives you trouble." "Pa, I'm not a child anymore." "No," Thomas said, his blue eyes serious. "But you're still my daughter." Inside, the hall pulsed with life. Ranchers in their Sunday best mingled with townspeople. Sarah's best friend, Mary Hutchins, waved from across the room, and Sarah was about to make her way over when she felt eyes on her. Jake Morrison stood by the punch bowl, his badge catching the lamplight. Not the sheriff's badge, that belonged to his father, William Morrison, but the deputy's star Jake wore like a crown. He was 22, handsome in the way of men who'd never been told no, with dark hair and the kind of smile that made some girls weak in the knees. Sarah had never liked him. He'd always carried an air of entitlement, as if the law his father enforced was a toy he could play with. There were stories, a homesteader's window broken, debts mysteriously forgiven, drinks at the saloon that never got paid for. Nothing anyone could prove, nothing his father would hear about. Jake raised his cup to her. Sarah turned away. The dancing started, and Sarah let herself get lost in it. She two-stepped with old Mr. Harrison, who smelled like tobacco and told jokes about his mule. She spun with Billy Chen, whose family ran the general store and who was too shy to meet her eyes. She was flushed and happy when the fiddler called for a break. The night air outside was cool and welcoming. Sarah stepped onto the back porch of the hall, where a few other people stood catching their breath. The stars were brilliant, so bright and close you could almost touch them. Sarah McKenzie. She turned. Jake Morrison leaned against the porch railing, still holding his punch cup. The others had drifted back inside. "Deputy Morrison," she said coolly, "just Jake tonight. We're all just folks at a dance, aren't we?" "I suppose." He moved closer. Sarah could smell whiskey under the punch-sweet scent of his breath. "You look real pretty tonight." "Thank you. I should get back." "Wait." His hand caught her arm, not hard, but firm enough that she stopped. "Why don't you ever dance with me?" "You never asked." "I'm asking now." Sarah looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. "I'm tired. Maybe another time." "Maybe another time," he repeated, his voice mocking. "You know, Sarah, you Mackenzies think you're better than everyone. Your pa with his big ranch, you with your books and your high horse ways. Let go of my arm, Jake." "Or what? You'll tell your daddy?" He laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. "My father's the law in this county. Don't forget that." Sarah tried to pull away, but his other hand came up to her face, fingers rough against her jaw. "Just one kiss, Sarah. That's all I want. One kiss from the prettiest girl at the dance." "No!" But he was already leaning in, his mouth pressing against hers, hard and invasive. Sarah shoved at his chest, twisted her face away, and his lips dragged across her cheek. She tasted whiskey and anger. "Get off me!" She planted her boot heel on his instep and pushed with all her strength. Jake stumbled back, surprise and fury warring on his face. "You little—" The back door swung open. Thomas McKenzie stood in the doorway, and behind him, Sheriff William Morrison. Both men took in the scene, Sarah breathing hard, her dress torn at the shoulder, Jake red-faced and swaying. "Sarah," Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet. "What happened?" "Nothing, Pa. I'm fine. Let's go home." But Thomas was looking at Jake now, and his expression could have frozen the sun. "Did he touch you?" Sarah hesitated. In that hesitation, everything changed. "Now, Thomas," Sheriff Morrison said, stepping forward. His voice was all smooth reason. "I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Young people at a dance, emotions running high. Did he touch you?" Thomas wasn't asking anymore. "He kissed me," Sarah said quietly. "I told him no. He did it anyway." The silence that followed was terrible. Thomas McKenzie took a step toward Jake, and Sheriff Morrison moved between them. "That's assault," Thomas said. "That's a kiss," Morrison countered. "At a dance between young people. Jake apologized to the lady." Jake straightened his shirt, some of his swagger returning with his father's presence. "Sorry if I misread the situation, Sarah. Thought you were interested." "You're a liar," Sarah said clearly. "That's enough," Morrison snapped. "Jake, get in the wagon. Thomas, take your daughter home. We'll forget this happened." "Forget?" Thomas's hands were fists at his sides. "Your boy assaulted my daughter, and you want me to forget?" "I want you to be reasonable. You know how things are. It's your daughter's word against my son's. And even if it went to trial, which it won't, because no judge in this county would hear it, what do you think would happen? You'd drag your daughter's reputation through the mud for what? A stolen kiss." Thomas was shaking now, rage radiating off him like heat. "This isn't over, Morrison." "Yes," the sheriff said quietly, his hand resting on his gun belt. "It is. Take your daughter home, Thomas, and think real careful before you make any decisions you can't take back." Sarah didn't sleep that night. She lay in her room, listening to her father pace the floorboards below. Her mother, Catherine, had helped her clean up, had held her while she cried angry tears, but had said little. What was there to say? They all knew how the world worked. In the morning, Thomas found Sarah in the barn. She was brushing down her horse, Mercury, with more force than necessary. "Sarah, I don't want to talk about it, Pa." "We have to talk about it." He leaned against the stall door. His face looked older than it had yesterday, new lines carved around his eyes. "I spent all night thinking. We could go to the territorial judge in Cheyenne. It's a week's ride, but—" "And say what? That the sheriff's son kissed me at a dance? Pa, Morrison was right about one thing. No one's going to care. I care. I know." Sarah set down the brush and turned to face him. "But what can you do? What can any of us do? That's how it is for women. You know that." Thomas looked at his daughter, strong, smart, unbreakable even now, and felt something crack inside his chest. It shouldn't be this way. "No," Sarah agreed. "It shouldn't." The next weeks passed slowly. Sarah threw herself into ranch work, riding fence lines until her legs ached, helping with the branding, anything to keep moving. Word had spread through the county, the way word always does in small places. Sarah felt the weight of eyes on her in town, heard the whispers. Some people were sympathetic. Others suggested she must have led Jake on, must have wanted it, must have been asking for it somehow. That was always the way. The woman was examined, dissected, blamed. Jake Morrison swaggered through town like nothing had happened. He'd been given a warning by his father, everyone knew, but what was a warning to a man who'd never faced consequences? Thomas grew quieter, grimmer. Catherine watched her husband with worry. She knew that look. She'd seen it before, years ago, when Thomas had been a younger man with a quicker temper. "Don't do anything foolish," she told him one night. "I'm not planning to." "Thomas McKenzie, I've known you for 23 years. I know when you're planning something." He looked at his wife, saw the fear in her eyes, and took her hand. "I won't do anything that'll take me away from you and Sarah, I promise." It was a promise he meant, but promises, like fences, can break under enough pressure. 2 months after the dance, Sarah rode into town for supplies. She'd been avoiding it, but they needed flour and coffee, and she refused to hide forever. She was coming out of Chen's general store, her arms full of parcels, when she heard the laughter. Jake Morrison stood outside the saloon with 3 of his friends, ranch hands who treated him like royalty because of his badge and his father's influence. They were passing a bottle and enjoying the afternoon. Sarah kept her head down, moving toward where Mercury was tied. "Well, look who it is," Jake called out. "Miss Sarah McKenzie. Still holding a grudge, Sarah?" She didn't respond, just kept walking. "I asked you a question," Jake said, and his voice had an edge now. He stepped into her path. "You know, you're not nearly as pretty when you're being unfriendly. That sour face doesn't suit you. Let me pass." "Or what?" He grinned at his friends. "She's going to tell her daddy again, going to cry about how mean Jake Morrison is." One of the ranch hands laughed. Sarah tried to step around Jake, but he moved with her, blocking her path. "You know what I think?" Jake said, leaning close enough that she could smell the whiskey. "I think you wanted that kiss. I think you liked it. But you had to put on a show because your pa was watching. That's what I think." Sarah's hand moved before she thought about it, a hard, cracking slap across Jake's face that echoed down the street. The laughter stopped. Jake's head had snapped to the side, and when he looked back at her, all the smirking charm was gone. His eyes were flat and cold. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. Sarah's heart was hammering, but she kept her voice steady. "Touch me again, and I'll do worse." She pushed past him, managed to get to Mercury, and rode out of town with her purchases. She didn't let herself shake until she was a mile out, and then she had to stop and let the trembling run its course. When she got home, she didn't tell her parents what had happened. But small towns have big ears, and by evening, 3 different neighbors had stopped by to tell Thomas about the confrontation. That night, Thomas cleaned his rifle. The next day, Jake Morrison rode out to the Circle M ranch. Sarah saw him coming and called for her father. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle cradled in his arms. Catherine stood in the doorway, and Sarah beside her. Jake reined in his horse 20 feet from the porch. He wasn't wearing his deputy's badge, Sarah noticed, just range clothes and a gun belt. "McKenzie," Jake called out, "we need to talk, man to man." "Nothing to talk about," Thomas said. "I think there is. Your daughter assaulted me yesterday in front of witnesses. That's a crime. My daughter defended herself. From what? Words?" Jake shifted in his saddle. "See, I've been patient. I apologize for the misunderstanding at the dance. I've let your daughter spread lies about me all over the county, but now she's put her hands on me, and that changes things. Get off my property. Not until we settle this." Jake's hand rested on his gun. One way or another. The air went very still. Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, could see the muscle jumping in her father's jaw. "You threatening me, boy?" Thomas asked softly. "I'm telling you how things are going to be. Your daughter is going to come into town and apologize, publicly. She's going to take back her lies, and then we're going to forget this whole thing happened." "And if she doesn't?" Jake smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd never lost, who'd never had to. "Then I arrest her for assault. She spends time in a cell. Things happen in cells, McKenzie, especially to young women without protection." Thomas went very still. When he spoke, his voice was calm, almost pleasant. "Catherine, Sarah, go inside." "Thomas," Catherine began. "Inside. Now." Sarah had never heard that tone from her father. She and her mother went into the house, but Sarah stayed by the window, watching. "Here's what's going to happen," Thomas said, setting his rifle against the porch rail. "You're going to turn that horse around and ride off my land. You're never going to speak to my daughter again. You're never going to look at her, think about her, or breathe in her direction. And if you threaten her again, if you even make her uncomfortable, I will end you. Not arrest you, not take you to court, end you. Do you understand?" Jake laughed. "You're threatening a deputy? You're threatening Sheriff Morrison's son?" "I'm making a promise." "You're making a mistake." Jake's hand moved toward his gun. "You think you're tough, old man? You think—" Thomas McKenzie moved. For a man in his 50s, he moved with shocking speed. He was off the porch and had Jake by the belt before the younger man could draw. Thomas yanked, and Jake came tumbling off his horse with a startled yelp. They hit the dust together, but Thomas was up first. His fist caught Jake in the jaw. Once, twice, a third time. Jake tried to fight back, but rage and fear had made Thomas unstoppable. He hauled Jake up and threw him against the water trough, then grabbed him by the hair. "You want to threaten my little girl?" Thomas's voice was unrecognizable. "You want to put your hands on her, force yourself on her, and then threaten to lock her up?" "Stop, please." Jake's face was already swelling, blood running from his nose. Thomas hit him again and again. Sarah was screaming from the window. Catherine was pulling at her husband's shoulders, but Thomas couldn't hear them. All the rage and helplessness of the past 2 months was pouring out of him, focused into his fists. It was only when Jake went limp that Thomas stopped. He dropped the younger man into the dust and stood there, breathing hard, his knuckles torn and bleeding. Jake Morrison lay crumpled and unconscious, his face a mass of bruises, but he was breathing. "Thomas," Catherine said quietly, "what have you done?" Thomas looked at his hands, then at his wife, then at his daughter's face in the window. Reality came crashing back. "Get him on his horse," he said. "We'll take him back to town." "You can't," Sarah said, coming out onto the porch. "Pa, you can't. Sheriff Morrison will what? Arrest me? He probably will." Thomas looked at his daughter. "But I'm not letting him wake up here. I'm not giving them any excuse to say he died on my property, that it was anything but a fair fight." They got Jake onto his horse, draped over the saddle. Thomas tied him in place and took the reins. The ride into town was silent. Catherine and Sarah followed in the wagon. When they reached Powder Creek, half the town came out to see. Thomas led Jake's horse straight to the sheriff's office and tied it to the rail. Sheriff Morrison emerged, took one look at his son, and went pale. "What did you do?" "He came to my ranch and threatened my daughter," Thomas said. His voice was steady now, resigned. He put his hand on his gun. "We fought. He lost." Morrison wasn't listening. He was pulling Jake down from the horse, checking him over. "Doc! Someone get Doc Harrison!" Thomas waited. He didn't run, didn't make excuses. Sarah and Catherine stood behind him, a united front. When Morrison finally looked up, his eyes were black with fury. "You're under arrest, McKenzie. I know. For assault, for attempted murder, for defending my family," Thomas interrupted. "For doing what you wouldn't do, for giving your son what he deserved." Morrison's hand went to his gun, and for a moment Sarah thought he might draw. But there were too many witnesses, too many eyes watching. "Put him in a cell," Morrison told his other deputy, "and get the judge. I want McKenzie tried and hanged before the month is out." Thomas McKenzie spent 3 days in the Powder Creek jail before the circuit judge arrived. During those 3 days, something unexpected happened. People started talking. Not about Thomas's crime, but about Jake Morrison's behavior, about the broken windows and unpaid debts, about the time he'd cornered Mary Hutchins behind the church, about the homesteader's daughter who'd left town suddenly last year. One story led to another and another. Women who'd been silent found their voices. Men who'd looked away admitted what they'd seen. The Morrison name had protected Jake for years, but bruises and silence could only last so long. When Judge Henry Blackwood arrived from the territorial capital, he found a town divided. Half the people wanted Thomas hanged, the other half wanted him freed. The trial was held in the same town hall where the dance had been. Sarah testified, her voice clear and strong, about what had happened that night and what Jake had threatened. Catherine testified about her husband's character. A dozen others spoke to Jake's pattern of behavior. Jake himself sat in the front row, his face still swollen, and said nothing. Sheriff Morrison sat beside him, stone-faced. The prosecution argued that Thomas McKenzie had nearly killed a deputy in a brutal, unprovoked attack. The defense argued that a father had defended his daughter against a criminal who'd hidden behind his father's badge. Judge Blackwood was a serious man with grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened to it all, took notes, and asked pointed questions. When the testimony was done, he didn't retire to deliberate. He simply stood. "I've heard enough," he said. "Thomas McKenzie, stand up." Thomas stood. Sarah gripped her mother's hand. "The evidence presented here paints a troubling picture," Blackwood continued, "not just of one fight, but of a pattern of behavior, of a young man who believed himself above the law and a father who enabled it, of a community that stayed silent while that young man terrorized its people." Sheriff Morrison's jaw tightened. "However," Blackwood said, "assault is assault. The law cannot sanction vigilante justice, no matter how righteous the cause. Thomas McKenzie, you are guilty of assault. I sentence you to 30 days in jail and a fine of $50. A murmur ran through the crowd. Morrison stood. "That's it? 30 days?" "That's it," Blackwood confirmed. Then he turned to Jake. "As for you, Deputy Morrison, or should I say former Deputy Morrison, I'm recommending to the Territorial Marshal that you be stripped of your badge and investigated for multiple counts of assault. If the victims choose to press charges, you will face trial." "You can't do that," Sheriff Morrison said. "I can, and I have." Blackwood's voice was cold. "Sheriff Morrison, your son is a disgrace to the badge and to the law. If you had any integrity, you would have dealt with him yourself. Instead, you forced a good man to do your job." He banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." Thomas served his 30 days. Sarah and Catherine visited him every day, bringing food and news. Jake Morrison left Powder Creek 2 weeks later, slinking away in the night. Rumor said he'd gone to California. No one missed him. Sheriff Morrison finished his term but didn't run for re-election. A new sheriff was chosen, a fair man with no family to protect and no debts to pay. The town slowly healed. Sarah never forgot that summer, the fear, the rage, the helplessness. But she also never forgot what happened after, how women found their voices, how the community, for all its flaws, eventually chose justice. 5 years later, Sarah McKenzie married Billy Chen in that same town hall. They turned part of his general store into a library where Sarah taught reading to anyone who wanted to learn, especially young women. Thomas lived to see his grandchildren. He never spoke much about those days, but sometimes Sarah would catch him watching her with fierce pride in his eyes. The world hadn't changed overnight. Men like Jake Morrison still existed, still thought they could take what they wanted. But one father had drawn a line in the dust and said, "Not my daughter. Not anymore." It wasn't perfect justice, but in the hard land of the American West, where the law was often just a badge on a bully's chest, sometimes imperfect justice was all you could get. And sometimes that had to be enough.